My name's Carys Bray and my debut novel is A Song for Issy Bradley. A Song for Issy Bradley is the novel about the Bradley family during a particularly sad autumn. Their youngest daughter, Issy, dies suddenly and unexpectedly, and the novel explores what happens next. It's the story of Ian, the dad, who is a Mormon bishop, and he's also a full-time maths teacher, and he thinks that if everybody just carries on like the Mormon pioneers, that everything will be fine. And it's the story of his wife Claire, who is waiting for a sign from God, and she just wants everything to stop while she comes to terms with what's happened. It's the story of their teenage daughter Zippy, who is in love for the first time, and the story of Alma, who is sceptical and cynical and perhaps doesn't fit with the rest of the family. And it's the story of their 7-year-old son Jacob, who thinks that if he just has enough faith and just tries, that maybe he can fix everything with a miracle. When I was thinking about writing a novel, it seemed like an awfully big thing to do. And I'd written short stories in the past, and I almost felt like I could sort of trick myself into writing a novel if I started from a short story place. So I had this picture of Jacob in the back garden digging up a bird, and I sort of put that into a short story, that sort of self-contained short story, and I told myself that if it worked as a short story, then I would carry on. And when I'd finished that story, I thought, yeah, it's okay. And so I wrote the bit that came before, and then I wrote the bit that came after as well. I've drawn on my own experience to an extent. Yeah, I grew up in a Mormon family, and I grew up listening to these stories, miraculous stories. Some of them were quite prosaic and were to do with things like lost car keys, or people being inspired on the way to work to take a different route, and you know, not knowing whether what had happened on the route they would normally take, but you know, it had all been for the good. And then occasionally there were some stories that were quite you know, sounded quite miraculous. There was one where somebody had apparently been resurrected, and they said afterwards that when they were resurrected they could feel the life coming back into them like a blanket unrolling. And I sort of had quite ambivalent feelings about these stories. When I was growing up, I didn't disbelieve them, but I just felt that I was not the sort of person to whom miracles happened. Felt a bit like T.S. Eliot's Prufrock, who knew the mermaids could sing but didn't think that they would sing to him. And then as I got older, I really disbelieved the stories, but I was always still interested in them, and I still am interested in miraculous stories and why people tell them. So I started with Jacob's voice, and I found that Jacob's voice came quite easily. I've got 4 children, so I'm used to being surrounded by children's voices. And then I sort of had to work on the others. I knew I wanted them to be quite a big family, and when I first started to write the novel, there were more children than there are now, and I think there were too many different voices, so I had to reduce the numbers of children, and then sort of work on each voice to try and make it different to the others. And I wanted the novel to sort of work a bit like a kaleidoscope, so it could sort of go click, 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 and you could move around the family, and every time it moved you'd sort of get to see everything in a different way. You know, see all the patterns and things that were happening differently. I identify with all the characters to an extent. I think people might expect that I would identify most with Claire as a mother, but I probably don't. I almost sort of by the end of the book, felt a little bit impatient with her and felt like she needed to do something, which she finally does in the end. But I really like Alma, and I like his awkwardness and his sort of cynicism, but his goodness as well. I think that makes him quite an interesting character. The novel's set in Southport, which is where I live, and before I'd started writing it, I never imagined writing a novel set in a small northern town. In my head I thought that I had to write a novel, you know, that was set somewhere really exciting and somewhere really well known. But when I started thinking about the novel, I realised that where I live was the perfect setting for it. Not only because I know it so well, but because also the Southport as a town is sort of this long, thin town, and it runs up against the sea wall. And there's a line in the novel that says that the town has its back up against this wall. And I think there are times in the novel where Claire, the mother, also has her back up against a wall and is sort of in this dangerous situation that's mirrored in the landscape of the beach. So yeah, it seemed like a good place to set the novel. I really like the moment, I really like the scene when Zippy is wearing the wedding dress, and I like it because it explores this tension, I think, in Mormonism, where young people are told that they mustn't have sex before they get married, and they mustn't think about sex before they get married, but that the most important thing they can do is to get married and have lots of children. So they're being told not to think about this, but at the same time the adults around them are all talking about it all the time. And so there's this tension then, and during that wedding dress scene, people in the church hall are having a pretend wedding with no bridegrooms. It's just all the girls dressed up pretending. But in one of the classrooms at the back, Zippy's there and not pretending with Adam, and I just sort of quite like the idea that the adults are all pretending and Zippy and Adam aren't pretending. And even when Zippy is rescued by Sister Valentine says, you know, now we're going to go and look at honeymoons. And so again, they're back to, you know, thinking about sex, but not thinking about sex at all because it's not allowed. So I quite like that scene. Jacob, the 7-year-old, his scenes were quite easy to write, I found, because he was the first character, and I knew right from the beginning what was going to happen to him during the story. And because the language is quite simple as well, I think his chapters pretty much stayed the same. They didn't need very much editing. But Ian, the dad, I found all of his scenes were quite difficult. He was quite a polarising character. When I shared those chapters with my writing group, there was people who felt that he was like, you know, sort of the tragic hero of the book, and who really empathised with him, and there were other people who would give me the chapters back with, you know, sort of exclamation marks in the margins, and really frustrated with him. And I felt like I was on a tightrope with Ian the whole time, between him sort of being a sort of noble, tragic figure and an incredibly irritating figure, and I wanted to try and sort of stay in the middle of that. So he was quite hard to write. I think readers will take away a feeling that even in a family where people are very, very different, and where they have their disagreements, that they can support each other and that they can help each other through really difficult times. When I was writing it, when I was approaching the end, there's a series of coincidences at the end of the book which I think the family, when they look back on them, will perceive to be miraculous. and I wasn't planning on having anything like that at the end of the book at all. But as I was just reaching the end, I sort of couldn't resist the sort of drive to do that, and I think that maybe in writing the end like that, it was perhaps a sort of tacit acknowledgement that actually, despite my own cynicism, I think sometimes miraculous things can happen.